John Dickie. I'm director of Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland. We're a national charity. As the name implies, our whole purpose is to work for an end to child poverty in Scotland as part of CPAG UK across the UK. We do that by raising awareness of child poverty and the impact it has on children and families, identifying evidence-based solutions to that poverty, and then seeking to influence and inform policymakers at every level in the interests of low-income families. And we're also developed over the years very particular expertise in welfare rights and the rights to social security that families have, and provide a range of information, casework support and training to organisations and individuals right across Scotland who are working directly with families to ensure that they're able to exercise their rights to social security within the existing system. And through that, we gather a lot of evidence about what is and isn't working with the social security system. And that's absolutely critical for us in terms of informing our policy and influencing work. We also have a particular strand of work working with young people, parents and staff in schools, and to look at how lack of money kind of limits full participation at school. The latest official statistics tell us that 1 in 4 of Scotland's children were officially recognised as living in poverty. Issues around the Family Resource Survey and collecting survey responses during the COVID pandemic means that we don't have official statistics for 2020-21. So the 1 in 4 figure relates to pre-COVID, pre-cost of living crisis, pre the increased universal credit during COVID, but also pre taking that away, pre the introduction of Scottish Child Payment. So it's official statistics a bit out of date, but give us a sense of just the scale of the numbers of children living in poverty. That's children living below a poverty line that's actually less than 70% of the minimum income that the general public believe is needed for a basic but socially acceptable standard of living. It's a poverty that's predominantly about children living in families where adults are working. 2/3 of children living in poverty in Scotland today are living in a family where at least one adult is working at least part-time. So whilst the risk of poverty is far higher where parents aren't working at all, the reality is that most children in poverty are living in working families. It's a poverty that affects children in every part of Scotland. And I've put the link there to the End Child Poverty statistics. And there's a useful interactive map there that gives a sense of the scale of poverty at local authority and at constituency level across Scotland and across the UK. So we know there are particular areas where there are very real higher levels of child poverty, over 1 in 3 in Glasgow, for example. It's an issue that faces children and families in every single part of Scotland. It's a poverty that has shifted from being a grinding poverty of struggling to get by and income inadequate to provide as fully for your children, to one that is increasingly leaving families in acute income crisis. It's a poverty that has left families brutally exposed to the soaring inflation that we're seeing now. Families have very little left to cut back on. So when we see economic shocks like the current one, there's very, very little for families to cut back on to be able to cope. It's a poverty that has been rising over the last decade, primarily driven by cuts to the value of child and wider family benefits, but also increasingly precarious employment, with many parents finding themselves either in jobs with very limited security and very limited ability to ensure that they've got secure hours to be able to support their families. Important to remember that as if 1 in 4 children living in poverty wasn't stark enough, some children are at even greater risk. So we know that where families are affected by disability, nearly 1 in 3 children affected by poverty. Where children are growing up in single parent families, 2 in 5 of those children living in poverty. Nearly a third of children in larger families with 3 or more children growing up in poverty. 1 in 3 where the youngest child is under 1. Over half of children growing up where the mum is under 25 growing up in poverty, and 2 in 5 of those in minority ethnic households living in poverty. But just a couple of examples in terms of the long-term impacts of growing up in poverty. We know that children growing up in the lowest income households are almost 4 times more likely to just have fair or bad or very bad health compared to children growing up in the highest income households. 4 times as likely to have poorer mental well-being than those in the highest incomes. And we know actually from some of the recent survey evidence, issues around mental well-being are becoming even more acute with the current pressures. Even before children start school by the age of 5, there's a gap of 10 months in children's problem-solving skills and 13 months in their vocabulary development between children growing up in the lowest income households and those in better off families. And that gap, unfortunately, widens as children progress through school. And we know that by S2, for example, pupils in areas of low deprivation are doing twice as well, performing twice as well on, for example, numeracy. So there's a whole range of statistics on health, on education, on well-being that demonstrates that child poverty impacts fundamentally on children's ability to realise their rights under the UNCRC. I've just pulled out a few quotes here from work that we've done in schools through our Across the School Day project, where young people talk about not being able to go to the after school club, not being able to go to the school trip, how that kind of isolates you. Another young person talked about their experience of being bullied because they were wearing the same shoes since they'd been in P7. Children very aware of the pressures their parents are under. They know that sometimes they can't afford food for their homes. And they feel the pressure to bring in money for class activities and feel like they're letting other people down when they're unable to do that. Really important when we're looking at all this to remember that there is absolutely nothing inevitable about these levels of poverty, and that progress can be made. We know that between the mid-1990s and 2010-11, we saw significant reductions in levels of child poverty. 170,000 children lifted out of poverty in Scotland alone. The rate of child poverty dropping from 1 in 3 down to less than 1 in 5. That was a level of progress on reducing child poverty that was both historically in the UK and actually internationally unprecedented. And it didn't just happen by chance. It happened because there were policies put in place to make it happen. Policy work at UK, at Scotland and at local level. Improvements in childcare at every level. Increases in child benefit, improvements in rights in the workplace, improvements in maternity and paternity rights, all drove improvements in the incomes of our lowest income families. And particularly in Scotland, continued investment in social housing helped to keep housing costs down, in part contributing to lower levels of child poverty in Scotland than elsewhere. Over that same period, we saw real improvements in measured indicators of child well-being. Of course, the reality is that over the last decade, we've had a decade of austerity cuts, particularly to social security, that have largely reversed that progress. In terms of social security alone, £38 billion less support to families in the UK compared to the start of that period, inevitably having an impact on levels of child poverty. And we've seen child poverty rising across the UK, and estimates that at UK level that those levels of child poverty will continue to rise, suggesting that 32% of children in the UK will be in poverty by 26-27 under current economic forecasts and policies. There's, again, I think, real cause for optimism, at least here in Scotland. Despite the situation we find ourselves in, there is evidence that we are turning a corner here in Scotland, that the policies that are being put in place will shift that upward curve on child poverty. We have the Statutory Child Poverty Act with statutory targets to reduce child poverty to less than 18% by 2023-24 and to less than 10% by 2030. A range of other indicators as well that need to be met in terms of reducing material deprivation, reducing persistent poverty. We have a national delivery plan set out by the government that identifies the right actions that are needed at local and national level to further improve the incomes of our lowest income families, reduce the costs they face and make progress on child poverty. That plan has been backed up by very real policies and investment that are already and will make a substantive impact, not just for individual families, but for overall rates of child poverty in Scotland, not least the Scottish Child Payment, currently a £20 per week payment for eligible children and families in receipt of universal credit and under 6, but about to be rolled out to all children and families in receipt of universal credit under 16, and also its value increased to £25 from the middle of next month. So the general modelling would suggest that that policy alone should reduce child poverty by around 50,000 children in Scotland, significant percentage point reduction in what the numbers of poverty, numbers of children who would otherwise be in poverty. But of course, also that additional money reduces the depths of poverty for those who'll still be in poverty despite it, and protects many other families, many other children from poverty. It's not the only investment. The investment in Best Start payments, in the rollout of universal free school meals, in increasing levels of funded childcare, and in support for parents in terms of employability support, are all beginning to contribute to what we would expect to see as a downward trend on child poverty in Scotland, and actually brings the interim target to reduce child poverty to less than 18% of children by 2023-24 within reach. Others would suggest it may be just missed, but I think it does show that the policies that are being put in place bring that very, very, very much within reach and need to be backed up, supported and improved on to make sure that we do hit that target and beyond. Analysis that we commissioned from University of Loughborough at CPAG suggests that the package of support that's available now in Scotland alongside lower childcare costs mean that the net cost of a child in Scotland has been reduced by up to 31%. Of course, we're still a long, long way off meeting that 2030 target of less than 10% of children living in poverty. And in the context of the current cost of living crisis, it can all feel a long, long way away for individual families and children in Scotland. So what in terms of the cost of living crisis, a parent at the JRF event on Monday described it as a cost of surviving crisis, a cost of surviving crisis. That this is not about actually living, it's just about the cost of surviving now. We know that families with children face energy bills on average 30% higher than other households. Resolution Foundation telling us that households with children are at greater risk of being into poverty, of being pushed into poverty by the current crisis. We know that despite the UK energy price guarantee, the average family of 4 receiving universal credit will still need an additional £1,400 over the next 6 months to stay warm. And I think what all this does is tells us how important not just the headline relative child poverty measure is, but how important the material deprivation, the absolute poverty measure, and the will be in terms of understanding the impact. Because even if levels of relative child poverty come down, when median incomes are falling across the board, families may still actually be left with less to be able to buy their actual standard of living, actually coming down because of the rising inflation. So that material deprivation measure will become particularly important to keep an eye on. Just a few comments there from parents talking about how it's feeling for them in the current situation, drawn from, as I say, the JRF report published on Monday, but also from OPFS's report published a couple of weeks ago. Parents just talking about how it terrifies them, the thought of the impact of the hike in gas and electricity prices, anxious about keeping their children warm, talking about just the levels of stress, the anxiety they're facing. And maybe just give you a sense of what some of our priorities as CPAG in Scotland are right now in terms of what needs to happen. So at UK level, I mean, our absolute priority needs to be that family benefits, social security benefits need to be uprated in line with inflation. I mean, before the last week, we were talking about the need for that to happen and to be brought forward. And now it's about just making sure it happens in April. But hopefully we're seeing across the political spectrum a recognition that the idea of imposing a real terms cut in the value of social security support on families in the current situation is unconscionable. But we need to go further than that. It's not just about uprating. You know, those drivers of child poverty at UK level, some of the biggest drivers pushing more and more children into poverty are welfare reforms that have been well established, the benefit cap and the 2-child limit, both arbitrarily limiting the level of financial support available to families, and families who are at particular risk of poverty, particularly larger families. At Scotland level, really important that Scottish benefits, at the very least, hold their real terms value in the coming year, not including the £25 Scottish child payment. So on the one hand, government can point to the fact that the child payments value has increased from £10 in March this year, and it'll soon be £25. So we have seen very welcome and significant increases in the value of the Scottish child payment. But the reality is, if that's to hold its value, if it's to buy the same things next year for families as it's buying in November when it's up to £25, it too needs to be uprated in line with inflation. More generally, we just need to continue to make sure that ending tackling child poverty really is at the heart of the budget process. And as budgets come under increasing pressure in Scotland, to ensure that commitment to tackling child poverty remains at the heart of decision, and actually that we go further and start designing Scottish budgets with that 2030 target in mind, and ensuring that across all areas of government policy, we're proofing decisions for their impact on child poverty. We need to do more to end the need for food banks, and welcoming Scottish Government's commitment to that, but that needs more, including action to prevent the poverty in the first place, but also improved cash-based responses to acute income crisis. And finally, continue to make sure that those financial barriers to full participation